we're looking at 2 Samuel 12 through 21. And I'm not really going to go into the Psalms. The Psalms revolve around these things, and they express different attitudes and principles that are important for the individual, and they're expressed in that. And we will, like I said, we will see Psalm 51. But the story is pushed along through 2 Samuel 12 through 21. So in 2 Samuel 12, we have Nathan rebuking David and David's repentance. And remember, this is because of this whole ordeal we talked from last week's reading of David and Bathsheba, and then he was afraid he was going to be found out of her pregnancy, and so he called Uriah home and encouraged him to spend time with her so that the pregnancy would be blamed on him, and of course that didn't work, and so he decided to go ahead and have Uriah killed. It's pretty ironic. We didn't get to go through that Wednesday because of the singing night, but there are a lot of ironies there. One of the biggest ironies is that Uriah was listed as one of David's strongest fighters, and Bathsheba's father was also listed as one of David's mighty men. So two different mighty men were abused and betrayed, and of course she was abused in that sense too. I was thinking through that. How is it that she was? It seemed to be from the wording so compliant, and there's been a lot of people who have used that to say, well, she was probably the one that was at fault because she's the one that seduced him. I've actually heard a sermon where a man said, if that woman hadn't have been out there displaying herself for David, none of this would have happened. Well, the scriptures are far from teaching that idea. People have to bathe, and they did it in certain places at certain times, and they expected privacy when they did it. It's not an indication of anything that she did wrong on her part. And yes, she probably could have resisted, but the likelihood of that going well for her would not have been nothing. There's no way that you could assume that things would have gone well for her. If he was willing to kill Uriah to cover up his sin, what would he be willing to do? Not only to her, but to her family as well, if you spurn the advances of a king. So I have a hard time thinking that she's guilty, although even in the discussion that comes afterward, there's not one statement made where Bathsheba has to repent of anything. She didn't do anything wrong. So we're talking about a complete abuse of power, obviously, from David, and everything's focused on him being the culprit and doing the wrong things. So anyway, Nathan rebukes David in 2 Samuel 12, and this is, remember, he told the story. It's an excellent story, the parable that he gave of the man who had a sheep that he loved and was a pet to him, even slept in the same bed. I mean, this thing was, we would say, like a lap dog today, right? And you know how close people can get to those animals. Well, there was another man who was rich and had all kinds of lambs, and somebody came and visited him, and when they came to visit, he didn't want to use his own lambs to sacrifice, to give to this person, which was the custom of the time. So he went and took it from this man who only had the one. And David was furious. That man deserves to die. And then Nathan said, it's you. You're the one who did this. And then he confessed. And Psalm 51 and several other psalms actually were written around this time to show the heart that he had. And so he came back to God, and he was actually forgiven. And he said he would not be killed for this. He would not be put to death for this, which is again, one of those things where we don't know how God decides to do things that he does. And the reason I say that is because if almost anyone else did that, they would have been put to death. But David didn't. I mean, David did it, and he wasn't put to death. So there's a lot of things there. It could be because he's a king and he's in a situation where God doesn't want to remove him as king right now. There's many factors that we could say are involved, and it kind of shows that even the law of Moses had more complexity to it than simply thou shalt and thou shalt not. There's a complexity here, evidently, and I don't know how it worked. It's also possible that the people just refused to try to put him to death. I don't know, but we can see a lot of examples of people being put to death, and we see some examples where they weren't for their sins. Then we have the whole debacle with Uriah, who was put to death and for doing nothing except being faithful to David. So anyway, David repents, and it turns out that his son, the baby born from that situation with Bathsheba, died as a result of David's sin. Then in chapters 13 and 14 of 2 Samuel, we have the story of Amnon, who raped his half-sister Tamar, and his brother Absalom kills Amnon and goes into exile. So we could say the sins of the father are repeated, right? Everything started falling apart when this one event with Bathsheba. There's several events there, but everything started falling apart. And it definitely shows a contrast between what we think of David and what he actually was. And it also, we also can recognize that people have ups and downs in life, and they make stupid decisions, and I'm not justifying anything, but we all recognize that we all make mistakes and we all do things that are wrong, and then at some point we have to be forgiven and allowed to continue on and function in society, or else be put to death. And that's, this is what we're seeing here with David, but there are always consequences to sin. And the consequence here was the way that Amnon treated his half-sister. That's a direct result of the attitudes that we can see in David, and really, generally speaking, most men of the culture, how they viewed women. So this is Absalom is furious because of this. He hears about this and kills his brother, and now he's running into exile because of that, because David's furious that there was a death. Then 2 Samuel 19 through 20, 15 through 18. Absalom returns from exile, and he plots to gain popularity with the people. So he forms a rebellion against David, and David has to flee from Jerusalem, and Absalom becomes king. And then in 19 through 20, after Absalom was killed in battle, David returns to Jerusalem and is restored as a rightful king. But then there's another rebellion by Sheba, so there's a lot of unrest. The rebellion of Absalom was also directly related to David's sin with Bathsheba, or at least indirectly related. It's related. And you can imagine some of the arguments that Absalom could have been making about David. We'll talk about this actually Wednesday. But some of the things that he would have been easily saying was, look at how David treats his closest people. Why do you think he's not going to be betraying you? That would be the argument I would use, right? So anyway, we have the rebellion of the coup of Absalom and David's return after all that settled down. Then in 2 Samuel 21, first 14 verses, there's famine that hits Israel, and this is a punishment that came because of Saul's treatment of the Gibeonites, and the Gibeonites were seeking justice and evidently were calling out to God, and God punished Israel because of the sins, and Saul drove them out of Israel while he was king in his haste the way it's described, it's his zealousness for Israel and for Judah. And so when he did that, they were demanding justice. They asked David, when David found out that this was a punishment, he went to the Gibeonites and said, "What do you want?" They said, "We don't want you to give us money. We don't want you to kill anyone. We want you to give us 7 sons of Saul," or 7 descendants of Saul. And so David handed them over, and they hung them. And that's how the famine was stopped and abated. They were put to death. Then the rest of that chapter and also 1 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 4 through 8, we have David battling the Philistines, and several giants are listed there that they battled against, which is interesting. Remember, we're talking about there's a growing number of people today that believe that there were 100-foot giants on the earth, and there's all kinds of crazy ideas out there that have evidence. And now with AI, they have even more. AI can create images like nobody's business, and there's all kinds of things being created to try to prove this. There were giants in the Bible, and it wasn't as a result of angels and humans having babies together, like it's commonly said. It's never actually stated in the Bible. It's just invented. We're going to have a lesson about that one day too. But there are giants, and they're human beings, just like the rest of us. But are there any people we might call giants today? I know of a man who is in the NBA who is over 7 feet tall. Is that a giant? Yeah. To me, yes, it's a giant. So someone can be giant without being 30 feet tall, right? That's the idea. Goliath was probably 9.5 feet tall. We don't know exactly. One of the reasons we don't know about Goliath is because the cubit was the measure, and a lot of modern scholars trying to discredit the Bible would say, well, a cubit was approximately equal to a foot, and so he was only 6 feet, which would have been exactly, that would have been, if you're 4'8", which was the average height of that day, which I don't know how they know that. If you're 4'8" and you run across someone who's 6'7", you're going to think that's a giant. Well, no, the cubit has always been measured. At the minimum, it's the distance between here and here. At the minimum, that was 1.5 feet. There was actually also what they called a royal cubit that was created in Mesopotamia, in Babylon, and we don't know if they created it and just called it a cubit, or if they took the cubit that they had and standardized it, which we try to do. We say, well, what is an inch? There's actually a standardized inch where you can go official place to go and say, this is exactly how long an inch is. So we can set all our measurements by that. It's possible that's what the Babylonians did. So in establishing that, it actually turned out to be around 2 feet long for that. I guess they took the tallest person they could find and measured from here to here, and it was 2 feet. I don't know how they did it, but they established it. So he was anywhere from 9.5 feet to what? 12 feet tall, or 13 feet tall, somewhere in there. Doesn't really matter. He's a big guy. And his brothers were also big. Someone said that when David went and fought Goliath, he picked up 5 stones because there were 5 brothers. And there were 5 brothers. I don't know if he was intending to face all 5 of them. That never was mentioned in the story, but it is an interesting thought. Anyway, so David battles the Philistines and their giants. And then also in 1 Chronicles chapter 20, the first 3 verses, which you may not catch this, but it's way out of order. Because in 1 Chronicles 20, the first 3 chapters corresponds with 2 Samuel 12, which we read, at the beginning of our readings. And that's the city of Rabbah is captured. And this was the place that Uriah was killed. Interestingly, to me, this is maybe not to you, but to me, it's interesting that the book of 1 Chronicles never mentions David's sin with Bathsheba or the death of Uriah. Doesn't mention it. And there are reasons for that. One of the reasons is because when it was written and why it was written to put the best possible light on David, because they're trying to restore the people of God after they were taken into Babylonian captivity. So they spent 70 years there, and we have this, probably by Ezra, showing us this is who David is. He's just looking at the positive aspects of it. Well, it's not contradicting anything. It's just putting their best foot forward. We have the rest of 2 Samuel to give us even more information, which they would have had as well. So I'm not trying to hide, but still. Okay, that's the kind of an overview. Did anybody have any questions about the texts? Mm-hmm.
When God gave the gift of Solomon to build gave people dominion and everything, so we must have had some kind of standard form of measure.
Yes, and by that time it was. I don't know how standardized it was, but they had, when they said this is so many cubits long, they knew what they meant by it, right? Yeah, you're right. So yeah, yeah.
Why is it so hard for a person to forgive themselves?
Why is it hard to forgive yourself? It comes down to, in my opinion, it comes down to matters to your faith. And that may sound harsh, but ultimately we have to decide whether we believe that God forgave us or not. That's where we start. If God hasn't forgiven me, why should I forgive myself? But if God has forgiven me, that means that this sin is no longer accounted to me, and I must either believe that God forgave me and take His word for it and forgive myself, or decide that, well, God actually isn't going to keep His word and forgive me. So it comes down to a matter of what I believe. And I'm not saying that you can't go to heaven if you still have a difficulty with that. We all have problems with that. But I think the answer to it would be to to remind yourself first off, that you're forgiven. And from there, you have to work through it. Allow yourself the recognition that you are as much a human as anyone else is, and that everyone has things on the inside of their hearts. I know this not because I know your hearts, but because I've talked to so many people. Everyone has things inside they think, oh man, I wish I would have done that have difficulty forgiving. And if you don't have that difficulty forgiving, I would question some things about what you really think of sin, right? That's not to say that you can't have a clear conscience, but we tend to be more toward I don't want to forgive. And maybe going through this, we can see a little bit. We're going to look at Psalm 51. We'll see a little bit more about that. Anyone else have any questions about the text we read? All right, let's go to Psalm 51. This is after Nathan came to David regarding Bathsheba and all the things that happened because of that. And we're going to divide this up into several sections. And the idea is about maintaining a genuine relationship with God. And the reason I want to talk about it from this perspective is because if we're going to try to help other people, first of all, we got to figure out how to help ourselves. And we have to maintain our own integrity and maintain a good relationship with God, which is what David was doing when he wrote this. He's expressing how to have this relationship with God, and what we should be doing when we see and recognize sin in our lives. All right, so we have the background of 2 Samuel 11 with David's sin with Bathsheba and Uriah, and then the rebuke in 2 Samuel chapter 12 verses 1 through chapter 12 verses 1 through 12, which we've discussed. So instead of reading all that to save time, we'll just go ahead and get back into the psalm. And the first one is an acknowledgement of sin. The first 6 verses. He says, "Have mercy upon me, O God, according to your loving kindness, according to the multitude of your tender mercies. Blot out my transgressions, wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, and cleanse me from my sin. For I acknowledge my transgressions, and my sin is always before me. Against you only have I sinned, and done this evil in your sight, that you may be found just when you speak, and blameless when you judge. Behold, I was brought forth in iniquity, and in sin my mother conceived me. Behold, you desire truth in the inward parts, and in the hidden part you will make me to know wisdom." All right, let's look at, we have some questions here, but I want to ask some other questions here, kind of qualifiers. What does David have to do in these, well, it's not mentioned here in the verses, but what did David have to do in order to be forgiven? Acknowledgement, yeah, that's definitely here. What else would he have to do in order to be forgiven? Ask for it. True. Yes, offer sacrifices. Yeah, and he does mention that in here. He will. But the sacrifices were made because of sins that were done. It doesn't say when he made the sacrifice, but he made the sacrifices. But what was the reason that God forgave? Now, this is going to be this kind of a technical question, but what was the reason that God forgave David? Was it the sacrifices that David made, or was it the goodwill of God, the grace of God? Yes. And the sacrifices as well, right? Because these things have to be done. So we're not trying to minimize, I don't want to try to minimize the sacrifice, but I want you to think through the idea here that what did the sacrifice represent? So we take a lamb or a bull or whatever it was that they had to offer. And I'm not as familiar with this as I'd like to, but they'd take it to the priest, and the priest would, from what I understand, the priest would put his hands on it, and the guy who brought it would cut its neck, and it could be reversed. I can't remember, but there is guilt here that is being transferred, so to speak, to this animal. So what's going on with that? Why a sacrifice? Why death? Right. Yeah, that's true. Why would a sacrifice of a goat be what God intended to do in order for someone to be forgiven? So there's a recognition that this thing is dying because of what I did. I think that's part of it. Does that, in seeing it that way, doesn't that affect the way you see the sin? Of course. It shows the seriousness of it. And yes, it's just an animal, but it's an animal, right? And we tend to think that the bigger the animal, the more important it is. Because we don't have a problem squashing bugs. But if you're going to go out and behead cats, you're going to have a lot of problems with that, right? And you probably would on the inside. I talked to someone who worked in a butchering facility where they butchered pigs, and they do it as humanely as possible. But most people going through there, it messes with their head. It's terrible. And because you hear squealing, you see them trying to get away, there's all kinds of things that are happening. It's gruesome stuff. And of course, it's not humans, which would make it even worse, right? But it's still an animal that is living, that we can relate to, is trying to survive and cling to life. And here it is, we're killing it. This was not a lot matter where you bring a pig, or you wouldn't have brought a pig, sorry. you bring a goat or a lamb and you kill this. It's not a lot matter. There's blood everywhere. There's screaming. There's all kinds of bad things that are happening, and you're watching as the priests are dismembering this thing before your eyes because you sinned. This is happening. Well, does the death itself of an animal cause God to force God to forgive the person who brought it? No, it's not the fact that animal died that now God has to forgive you, but he won't forgive until you bring the sacrifices. Okay, so why would he require a sacrifice if that's not what requires God? The only reason that God forgives us is because he decides to, right? He set up qualities, and he set up boundaries, or what's the word I'm looking for? Qualifications for how that's going to take, or when that will take place. But we all know that God forgives because he decided to. Now, when he sees that and he promises that if you make this sacrifice, well, God's going to keep his word, and he's going to do it when he sees the sacrifice. But why would he want that sacrifice to be made? If it didn't actually force God to forgive, why would he require it? It's for the person who's bringing the sacrifice. It's to help them hear, to understand, right, and to see, and also it would help prevent, unless they were just calloused, it would help prevent future sins. Even the callous person could at least recognize this is costing me money, right? This is my fortune that I'm killing here. So it at least causes people to think, all right? So, and we say that. And so in application, though, let's just talk about this with relation to the cross. Is there a parallel? Yes.
When we're taking the Lord's Supper, we're commemorating,
We're remembering his death every week. Yes.
and that's where we come in contact with the Lord.
The sacrifice that was made by Jesus, there are a lot of ways of looking at this. And I didn't realize that until just recently, that there are a lot of ways of looking at it. And so there's some things that we don't completely understand related to the thinking process of why Jesus' sacrifice would apply to me. But there are some parallels from what we can see here. That when Jesus was sacrificed, what did Jesus say would have to happen in order for all men to come to him? Sorry? Had to be raised up. And when Jesus was talking about that, and I believe it's in John 6, I have to look it up again, he was talking about his death. He was going to be raised up from the earth. That's a statement concerning how he was going to die, which means what? He's going to be raised up on the cross. And this is what's going to draw all people to him. The sacrifice of Jesus is what draws people to him because it demonstrates, this is only part of the equation here, but it demonstrates that God's willingness to go to the furthest extreme possible to bring reconciliation to us. Just from that perspective, when we go to God in prayer and we consider the only reason that we will be forgiven by God is because of the sacrifice of Jesus, we're essentially saying to God, we come in, just picture it for me just a second. We have God on his throne and we have this huge throne room door, which we're told to come boldly to. But imagine someone walking up to the throne door of God and kicking it open, walking up to God and say, hey, I sinned, and go ahead and sacrifice your son for me, please. Just go ahead and do that so I can be forgiven. Would any of us dare even think of something like that? There's no way. There's no way that we would have the audacity to demand that God would sacrifice Jesus instead of killing us. But he decided to do it, and because he decided to do it, it becomes a matter of God's grace that he is going to sacrifice his own son. And how all that plays out, there are a lot of questions. But when we're looking at the sacrifice of Jesus, part of this is the recognition of what it took for my sins to be forgiven. That I see someone dying in agony because I wanted to have a little bit of fun. That makes an impact, or it should make an impact on us if we think about it in those terms, but we sometimes don't think that way. Then we also have the blood that was shed that has always been this way. If blood is shed by man, that man would also be killed. So if a man kills a man, that's where it all began. This is the death. There are many other things that were punished by death, and all sin ultimately leads to death. And so if you're going to die, you have to have a way in order to escape this death that is coming for us. And the only way that can be is when we put our faith in Jesus, who died for us, and we are baptized into him, we're raised up to walk in a new life. That's the only way it can happen, because we die. We die with him, and he's given us the opportunity to die with him. And because of that, we are sacrificing ourselves. He is sacrificed for us, and we are all brought to God. So this is a very important part of that. And we need to always remember that it's God's decision whether he forgives. And he's outlined for us how that's going to work, but it's not because we do it it's not because of our effort involved. Our effort is how God says, or when God says he's going to apply his grace. And that's why we have to remember that. So it's not a matter of works, which we understand. Ephesians 2 8 and 9 is, I don't know how many times it's been thrown in my face. We're saved by grace, not by works. You're right. But when God says, do this, and this is when I'm going to save you, then we do that because we trust him that he's going to save us, just like he promised. And that's not working our works, that's working God's works. Anyway, so looking at, coming back to Psalm 51, who is it that, according to verse 4, against you, you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight. So who is it that David sinned against? Yeah, he says it clearly. Did he sin against Uriah? Absolutely, yes. And Bathsheba, and Israel. I mean, there's so many ways that David sinned, but why would he say then that I've only sinned against you? Is this a kind of a denial that he's, I'm not really guilty for the people, I'm just guilty towards you? Do you think that's what he's saying? I don't think it's possible. So what does he mean? That's true. That's true. So he set the standard, and if we sin, we ultimately are always sinning against him. Any sin that we commit is always going to be against him, even if it's against someone else, right? Because we're breaking God's laws, and breaking the truth. Is there anything else to add to that? Sure.
Okay, when we say, like he said, my sin was never for me, and she said it's hard for us to forgive ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, we sin, then in the Bible it says that, we're forgiven and we repent. When we get to heaven, it says in the judgment, we're going to be judged by every deed done in the body.
Yeah.
Okay, are we going to confess, are we going to have to confess our sins to God then?
Yeah, that's a really good question. There's two ways of looking at it. One, you could say, well, that applies to the people who weren't forgiven. I have a hard time buying that because of the language. It says that everyone is going to have a judgment, right? But at the same time, it's also possible to see it as 1 John chapter 3, verses 1 and 2 tells us that we have an attorney of Jesus. So if in the end all the things that we've ever done wrong are brought to judgment, then we have an attorney that says that was forgiven. That's part of the debate, is that he won't remember them. I won't remember your sins, even from as far as the east is to the west. I'll remove these sins from you. Yeah. And that could be simply saying it's not going to be remembered as in toward your punishment. It's not going to be remembered for punishment, because there's a lot of passages in the Old Testament that talks about God remembering someone's sins and bringing the punishment on them. And it's not that God forgot their sin, it's that he decided to act on it. And so I think that's the idea, is I won't remember in the sense I'm not going to act on it, right? He's forgiven us. It's gone. Sorry? Wiped away, yeah. And, we forgive people all the time, and we talk about you need to forgive and forget. Yeah, we forgive and we forget, as in we're not holding it to them anymore. We're not holding them accountable to that anymore. But if someone rapes you, you're not going to forget about it. You're just not going to be able to forget, but you can forgive them if they repent. You can forgive. And so you don't remember in the sense of, I'm going to bring this up every time I see you, and I always think this way of you. No, we have to forgive and move on, but even as heinous as things are. But the idea is that not that we just have amnesia. First of all, I don't believe God can forget anything in the strictest idea. He knows everything that's knowable. If he knows everything that's knowable, he also knows the things that he has, quote unquote, forgotten, right? So I think it relates to God forgetting in the sense of deciding not to punish us for something. Any other thoughts? Nobody wants to open the can of worms, huh? That's true. That's true. Our sins won't be forgiven if we don't forgive. Yeah.
I think if you approach this, going back to the question of forgiveness and why it's so hard to forgive ourselves, we have to realize that every experience we go through in life, there are analogies throughout the Bible of things being transformed, changed, remolded into somehow. So we want to take an approach of a statue being chiseled out, God being the potter and us being the clay. No matter what we go through in this life, whether we've done it or someone else has done it to us, we are marked, we are changed by those things that we've experienced. And just like dealing with grief, right? Grief never, ever completely goes away. There are always experiences that's going to bring part, most, all of that emotion back to the surface to remind us what we have experienced. Forgiveness being one of those things that we also have to deal with, right?
Right.
And grieve over the things that we've done wrong.
Yeah.
So I think to your point, Jason, if we want to approach humanity as being a creation of God that's made in His image, we don't always act on the grief that we feel, right? It doesn't mean that it's not there. It's there, fully and present sometimes, but we don't always act upon that grief and approach that grief as in, I need to go back and deal with that person who caused it, or I need to deal with myself because I caused it on someone else.
Yeah, that's true. That's good points. And that is, and I like the idea that you said that we're changed by the things that happen to us, even the things that we do change us, and we recognize that. And when we're dealing with those, we have to come to accept the new reality of who we are now, that we've made the change, and embrace what it is that we can do with what we have. So one of the ways that we could, for example, help to overcome this self-condemnation is first to believe who God is and what He's promised, and then second, to use that to our advantage. Because if you are caught up in sin, if you've done something wrong, you can help other people who are facing similar things. You can give warning. You can help people who have been through it to say, this is what you can do to get through it in the best ways. There's all kinds of ways that we can use that. So even the sins and the resulting changes that come to our lives because of that can actually be used by God to benefit other people. And same thing with pains and same thing with all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
The simplest way I always approach it with anybody who's struggling with where they are in life is I tell them, okay, do you like who you are right now? And if they say no, okay, then what do you need to do to change that thing? Because bottom line is, we are who we are because of the choices that we've made, never in spite of those choices. We are who we are because of the choices we've made. And if you don't like who you are, then you need to do something.
We can always change. Yeah, right? Yeah, exactly.
Never go back and fix the things that we've done in the past.
We can move forward. We have to move forward. And, 1 John teaches us also that if your heart condemns you, we have a God who's greater than your heart. So just because we condemn ourselves doesn't mean that we're right. And questioning that is a good thing to do. Am I really such a bad person? Has God not forgiven me? Why can't I just let this go? And so, anyway, there may be a whole lot more to it, but yeah.
I always look at it more that we're created in the image of God, and God, part of His character is justice. There's a part of us, no matter what culture you're from, because it's part of humanity, being in His image, that demands justice. And a lot of times when we do something wrong, you don't necessarily suffer the consequences right then. But yet your conscience, your psyche knows that there should be something done about this, that it's wrong.
Yeah.
And therefore, it's hard when you've done something wrong, and yes, you've been forgiven, and maybe you're worried of the consequences. But a part of you knows that that's not the ultimate, you didn't get what you deserve.
True.
And so therefore, I feel like it draws us closer to understanding and having a love for God. Because where I can't forgive myself, where I struggle with that forgiveness for myself, it humbles me before Him that He's willing to do.
That He's willing to forgive. Yeah.
That He doesn't hold it against me.
I think.
And He also paid the price, and that's even more humbling.
Yeah, I was going to say that's
Because of what I did.
what I was saying earlier, that we have to go back to the cross and think. You say there's no consequence. Yeah, there is. Jesus died. So if we can put that somehow, associate that with my sin, you say, yeah, Jesus paid for that, right? It's been paid for, and I know that may not make us feel any better about ourselves, but because it might make us feel worse that somebody did that. But focus on the fact that God is the one who decided to do that. It's his decision, and we can be thankful for that. I think all those things work together pretty well. The second thing here, notice 7 through 12, which we don't have time to read, is to seek cleansing and renewal. He mentions here the hyssop that he says, "Purge me with hyssop" in verse 7, and there's death that is involved even in that. So go back and just run references on hyssop and look up what generally happened with the sacrifices that were made, and this would be related to the Day of Atonement, other things like this. That's what he's ultimately looking forward to, is the cleansing that comes. So what are ways that we can ensure that we're continuously seeking spiritual renewal? Practically speaking, what can we do to make sure that we're always seeking to be this renewal? Not that we're always finding sin constantly, but renewal, let me back up for a second. Renewal is not just going to God and be forgiven and your slate's clean. Once your slate is clean, you still are dealing with the consequences inside of what you did. You're still dealing with it, and you have to heal. So James tells us that the way we heal, part of the way we heal, is to confess our trespasses. The confession is not what forces God to forgive us. The confession is for our benefit so that we can heal from what we've done. That's a very different idea. So once we are forgiven, we confess to other people in the process of healing, and that's what James says, so that you will be healed, not so that you'll be forgiven. And the healing process is extremely important to keep us from going back there, or to keep us from making our life worse because we're feeling so guilty about stuff. So healing has to come into there. And then the last point I wanted to say really quickly, the last two verses, was the joy of restoration. So this is related to, we need to recognize and rejoice in the fact that God has forgiven us, and that will help reinforce in our minds the fact that God did forgive. I think that'll help us also. All right, well, thank you all for your cooperation, participation.